Thank you, Jake. Everyone's feeling fancy? Fantastic. Gives me great delight to introduce Anthony Kirke and his illustrious, fabulous and extraordinary panel group tonight. They will embark on a Q&A style event of information about their Sydney to Hobart experiences. Now, I hope I say this correctly. Anthony himself has completed 3 Sydney to Hobarts. Firstly, 2018 on the Far 40 Enterprise. He came second in Division 3 IRC and 13th IRC overall. Then 2019 on the Far 40 Enterprise as well. He came first Division 4 IRC and 22nd IRC overall. And more recently, 2022 on the GP42 Enterprise Next Generation. He came first Division 2 IRC and 7th IRC overall. He also won the Siska Trophy twice in 2021-22 season and last season 23-24. He's been a member of FSC for over 12 years and a valuable member of the Offshore Committee, now Keelboat Committee. Anthony has worked 2 stints on the board and is currently in his 2nd year as Vice Commodore. Please welcome Anthony, and he will now introduce the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. When I was asked to come and speak at this, I thought the best way to do this was to invite a whole bunch of other people to speak rather than myself. and one way though is to try and cover. So I think if I ask the right questions, then the panel here we're going to provide exactly the same answers I will anyway. And so if we could just introduce, we've got Geoff Bishop. Geoff's actually done 10 Sydney to Hobarts, going back to 87 with Prime Minister, when he was 21 on the day of the race start. That's correct. And in amongst that, some boats I think people know. So Prime Minister, True Blue, Red Jacket, and in Red Jacket, they were first in Division C and IMS in 99. We did have Giles lined up for tonight, but unfortunately Mike's not feeling well. Mikey's done 6 Hobarts, but the reason I wanted Mikey here is he's the old sailor who sailed the boat to Sydney, and we just checked all the rest of us and put it on a truck and caught a plane rather than sailing to Sydney, but we'll talk a little bit about some of those logistics. Todd's done 4 Hobarts, all on Sunpass 3600s. One on his own, and one on the boat that he owned that he then sold. And a couple on Mr. Lucky, and one of those is double-handed, with pretty margin. John's done 2 Sydney to Hobarts, but he's also done a Melbourne to Hobart and 6 Launceston to Hobarts, so down the other side of the coast. But he was on Waiuna with Máire and Todd in 23. And then Máire's done 2 Sydney to Hobarts, one with myself on Enterprise in 2018, and then most recently with Waiuna on 2023. Máire, Todd and John obviously haven't had enough because they're going back this year with Bill on Surrey. Although that's a slightly different length boat, isn't it, Todd? It's actually got a wheel rather than a tiller, and there's a few more people on the boat to help. So what we'll try and do tonight is just cover, I suppose, a range of things that not only just about Sydney to Hobart, but around sort of doing even just long distance sailing or long distance events and things like Frio to Indonesia, and the types of things we need to try and cover with preparation and safety. And so I'm going to do that really by throwing a few questions at the panel, and I've got some to start with, and we'll see how that goes, and then try and open it up to the audience. And then there's a bit of backdrop. We've just got some photos from just a whole range of Hobart's events, and apologies for the fact that most of them came off my computer. So Geoff, start with yourself. Been the one with the most Hobarts under you. If we look at Hobart, probably along with the Fastnet race, it's one of the most brutal races on an international calendar. You know, talk to me, you've been in 10, you know, what are the things that you really require to do to prep a boat? Because the thing you've got to do is, A, you've got to get to the end, and B, when you get to the Derwent, the whole race starts again. You've got to be able to competitively sail up the Derwent.
Thanks, Anthony, for that's a good question. Luckily, I'm always just the crew and normally just brought in at the end to get to Hobart. But so it really comes back to the owners. You know, the hardest thing is getting the boats ready. So it starts, and if you're doing the Hobart this year, you've got to sail 150 miles or more than 24 hours to qualify. So you've got to do that after June. So that's the first part. You've got to prepare your boat to do a qualifying passage and tick that box. Then in, I think it's September, you've got to start having your entries in, and you've got to have all the official documentation, safety inspections and all that stuff getting ready. You've got to pick your crew, and that's where sometimes I'll get involved with that, helping pick the crew, but in most cases from WA, they're taking their normal crews across to gain experience and just enjoy the race and take it for what it is. And for most people, it's ticking a box off to say they've done one of the world's hardest races in the world. So the biggest thing about a Hobart is 2 months beforehand is when really the work is done. And for me, making sure the boat is safe, making sure that everything's ticked off in that department, making sure the crew have all had their experience. And that goes, when you pick the crew, 50% of the crew has to have a sea survival at sea course. I've had to sail a Cat 1 race or sailed in the 150 nautical mile qualifying passage. And then you've got to have someone with a medic on board, someone with a first aid certificate or a doctor or a nurse. You've got to have a radio operator, so your navigator or the person talking the radio has to have the licences. So you've got to just tick all those boxes and make sure you qualify. And then it's getting your Cat 1 category for the race, because Sydney to Hobart is a Cat 1 event. So there's quite a bit to go through. Now, when you get about a month out is when I normally would get involved, where we start looking at the weather and watching what are the long-range forecasts and starting to plan for that way. If you're a racing boat and you're doing it for trying to win the event, you're doing it under IRC. Unfortunately, your certificates have to be lodged by October, I think the end of October. So you can't just make a certificate at the end, wait for the weather and say, here's what we're going to have. So you've got to plan out initially, quite a long way out, what you want to use. If you're not trying to win an IRC, it doesn't really worry you too much, but the weather does. So what type of food do I need on board? What type of weather gear do we need? What sail should I have on board? And for me, the 2 weeks before the Hobart is the hardest bit of work. I enjoy untying the lines off the dock and motoring out into Sydney Harbour, because for me it's just like, oh, thank God. You know, the safety gear's ticked, the life raft's in position. I'll give you an example. In 2001, I was a tactician on a 72-footer. Christmas Day, we're down there doing the last, Christmas Eve, the crew's cleaning the boat, getting it all packed, ready for Hobart. I tried to help open the back locker to get all the water out, to make sure there's no extra weight in the boat. As I did, I stuck my hand on the life raft, and the life raft took off. It inflated in the boat. So I'm looking for a knife, I'm going, I can't stab it. We're trying to we found the release valve and got the air out of it, but we now had to find a new life raft on Christmas Eve in Sydney. And those type of things really throw a spanner in the works. And I didn't have a fun Christmas, but we managed to get a life raft. Someone was good enough to find one for us and we were able to start. So all good. But that's the hard bit, is just getting the boat to qualify and get ready and tick all the boxes. The race in itself is the easy part, if you've done all the planning. I think that's most of it. You know, getting your crew, and like I say in WA, they take their crews, but getting a crew that works together, sails on the boat, knows all the routines, you can rely on each other, you know what your position is and you know how to do your job. That's probably the most important thing on getting to Hobart and getting there in a really good result. answer that?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Geoff. So you touched on one thing, is getting to Hobart, and so we did admit that none of us have actually sailed there. But Todd, the logistics of even getting a boat by truck from here to Sydney just doesn't even bear thinking about sometimes, let alone the cost of it. But I want to touch on some of the challenges that you have going from WA to Sydney.
Nothing money doesn't fix, I'd say. If you're embarking on a Sydney to Hobart from Perth, it's just an expensive exercise. And it's time consuming. There's a lot to do. So to truck a boat from here, to be lifted, rig pulled, packed, put on a truck. Most of the vessels now, the size of them, you need escort, which isn't a problem for the owner and skipper, it's just more money. My first one in 14, I actually had a new boat delivered to Sydney. So the second Kraken was delivered to Sydney. That in itself, it saves you the freight, the road freight and the hassles, but then you've got a new boat on the other side of the country that you have to commission and get race ready for the Category 1 race. That in itself has another whole host of challenges, and what Simon Torberson did last year with his new atomic bomb. Then you're there, you do the race, so you've got the boat in Hobart, and you go, well, I need to get it back to Perth as well. So you can sail back, well, I need to do the races. As most people will know, I don't get the boat back. I might write some cheques to do that, but I don't do it. So you can sail from Hobart back to Perth. What we done, we'd sail to Melbourne, lift the boat at Sandringham, pack it all up, repeat the exercise, truck it back to Perth, reassemble it here, resplash it, and most of the time, the relaunching is relatively straightforward. But logistically, to do this race, it's a big commitment. It takes a lot of time, a lot of resources to do it.
Yeah, and then you do run into, truck a boat over there and you're in Sydney and all the tradespeople are focused on the 100 Sydney boats and there's a West Australian boat. You're pretty low down the priority list. So you're trying to suddenly find a rigger. I'd have to say in the last campaign, we flew Christian and Steve over from WA to put the boat back together. At the end of the day, it was the cheapest and quickest way to put the boat back together. You don't exactly get a warm welcome in Sydney when you come from WA. So that is just another challenge.
Particularly if you're going to take their silverware.
Máire, there's a really confusing regime of safety requirements for Cat 1. Some of it over the top, the medical kits are lots of fun. What would be interesting to talk about the things that that are actually critical in terms of critical from what's critical for the crew as opposed to all the things you need on a checklist. And again, I know when we sailed with you, got a whole bunch of stuff in the first aid kit and you turned up with a whole bunch of other stuff that you thought was more important than everything the regs required you to bring. So I'd like to hear your view on the safety requirements.
Thank you. So from my experience, I have been sailing for about about 8 years before I actually completed the Sydney to Hobart, and I've done multiple races during that time. And my experience, I have a background trade of nursing, which helps. And then the other thing that I notice that we get is predominantly it's broken fingers, broken ribs, head injuries, noses, a variety of wounds, they can be anywhere, toes, something else. And I suppose one of the things that I did with the medical equipment, and especially for the longer races as I was getting used to it, I actually spoke to a few people around that. So I spoke to emergency physicians. I spoke to Helga, who works at Fiona Stanley in ED. She's a member here, and I spoke to an RFDS nurse as well. So somebody who actually operates at doing the retrieval. So what do they need? And then the other thing that I did is I accepted what Australians say that we need to bring, because you can't really argue it, even though I did petition them and say we should do something different. They kind of said no. But I tried. So what I would do is I have a few simple rules. So what I would like to do with anybody that I sail with, I actually ask them to let me know if they're taking any medication, and that information just goes between me and the skipper. And really that is so if we need to give them anything during the trip, that I know if anything will interact. So that's one of the first things that I do. It's completely private. I also ask the crew to take all of their own medication. So if you're on anything, you manage that. It's not anything that needs to come from me. Sorry. What I tend to do then is the medications, there are a lot, but I suppose at the end of the day, the way I look at it, if you didn't have them all, it would be the one time that, be like Murphy's Law, you'd be missing the one thing that you needed. But what you can do is you can actually divide them up into what you actually believe you would need most often, and then next level, and then the ones that you would need least often. So that's what I would tend to do. So predominantly, one of the things on many sailing boats is that people feel seasick, or they can get a headache, or some simple pain. So I would have those medications, I'd have them boxed up, and I would actually have them closer to the nav station. And then the next lot of medications, I would have them somewhere else, but they would still be fairly close by. And then the things that I didn't think people would need, I would actually have them stored somewhere else. So that from a space perspective, it makes it easier for everybody on the boat. I'm not a fan of injectables on a boat. In my experience, things don't happen in daylight on a flat boat. It's always nighttime, it's dark, it's bumpy. So what I try to do is, and I do have the experience behind it, and I spoke to the emergency physicians, so I actually changed somewhere, and we take morphine, but I also take another drug as well. That it's actually sublingual, you can put it onto your tongue, and so that makes more sense to me. The other thing that I would do is I would actually create a drug list for the crew that I'm sailing with. So when I sailed on one of the boats, one of our crew, if we were beating for the second day, what would generally happen is that they would actually get a spasm in their back. So I'd actually bring something along anticipating that spasm, so that we would actually be proactive rather than reactive when it would happen. And then those drugs would be quite nearby. What I would say is, in relation to some of it, there's a lot of antibiotics, antifungal, antiviral on the kit. And there would be a question, do we need them, do we not? And I can understand why somebody would say, no, we don't. But then I think if somebody does get hit by something, it is rusty, it is infected, it's any of those things, it's a good thing to get onto these drug therapies early. Some boats will do the race in 24 hours, some will do it in 2 days, some boats will take 7. So Australian sailing are really catering for the boat that's going to be out there for a longer period of time, rather than just somebody who's going to be in for a short period of time. The other advice that I would have, actually, this is just a slight slide on, if you're going to be using the morphine or your injectables, when you actually draw up from the ampule, what you actually have done is you've blunted that needle. So please change the needle over before you stab somebody, because it's going to be less painful for the person receiving the injection. It's just a slight side note, and so these are the kind of things that I think about. I give lamb chops work for John, actually. Yeah, and then the other thing that we tend to do is, I found that some of the dressings, so I changed some of the dressings because some of them are a bit flimsy and they don't actually hold. So making sure that when you're putting something on that it actually holds. So it's just trying to be proactive. One of the things that I think, and I'll go back to seasickness for this one, a lot of people feel that they won't get seasick, and I think there's an element of hope in that. So my big view is, it's not as much as it's about you, and I'm fortunate in touching wood somewhere. I haven't got seasick yet, but I haven't. But I've seen people who have, and it just seems to be the most debilitating, awful experience that you can have. So if you can prevent that, take your drugs early, Do you know what I mean? Don't rely on hope. You know, day 3, day 4, you know, if you're feeling good, you know, go for your life. But yeah, start early.
Right, that's really good. Warren, I think key point there is you've got a bunch of safety rules. But when you're out there sailing in these conditions, you need to think about things that you actually need to do to keep your crew and yourself safe. And just complying with the rules isn't actually necessarily going to do that. And a bunch of them are actually pretty irrelevant. And just through experience, so it's what are the things that you really need to do to look after the safety of yourself and the crew. And the seasickness is a big one. You know, leading into the 2022 Hobart, we ended up having a conversation. We were doing the East Coast, and I had to sit down with someone and say, you can't come with us. Doesn't matter how many drugs we put into you, when the sun goes down, you end up seasick, and you're seasick all night until the sun comes up. And we aren't going to put up with that for 3 days, and we had to ask them to leave the crew. But it didn't matter what drugs he took. As soon as the sun went down and he lost the horizon, it was so, and those are things actually better to figure out before you build a bass straight. John, this one, and you preempted this one. So it's blowing 40 knots, and you're in the middle of Bass Strait, and do you understand the chain of command? Who's actually making the decisions? Is it the owner? Is it the navigator? Is it the tactician? Is it something you should have figured out on the dock before you got on the boat?
Yeah, look, people's moods change. You know, when you get scared, or when you get wet, and when you get tired, or when you're taking drugs, you don't necessarily know how you're going to react. So that's probably the first thing, that you can be a bit irrational, and some more than others. And I guess the other thing is that it's really good to establish the decision making on board before you leave, so that when it comes down to it, and it doesn't have to be a blanket, the skipper's responsible for absolutely everything, right? But it can be, if things are going poorly, or, you know, a good one is you start breaking gear, and usually it'll, you know, a water tank will go, you'll leak a bit of fuel, something or other will happen. And some people, if you're not feeling well and you're really tired, you might go, I think we need to pull the pin and head into Eden, or head into somewhere else, or turn around, right? Now, you've got a lot of people invest a lot of time, so then you need a bit of a collective decision about whether you're going to continue racing or not, you know, and that becomes quite challenging. So, probably in the races I've done, they generally, you'll start off with a schedule, and you'll have everyone going through their bits and pieces, watch systems and meal systems and all that sort of thing. But as people go down, and as they get sick, and as things start to change or the weather deteriorates, then it's important you've got some backup. And the backup may be going to a kind of a survival mode, and the navigator becomes critical, because they're going to tell you, you've got to get through another, it might be another 12 hours, or we can get through that and then we're going to be fine. If it's going to be another 2 or 3 days, then you may just decide to turn around and go back. So I think that, you know, we had in the last West Coast that thing happened. We tore the main, we couldn't charge any power. We're on the west coast of Tas at a place called Cape Grim, about heading towards Hell's Gate. You know, they're all pretty attractive sounding places, and there are 10 of us on board, and a couple of people, probably 3 or 4, were absolutely adamant that we had to go back up round and onto the north coast to Stanley. But when you looked at the weather, it was all coming from the east, and going back round these hummocks and back into that weather was just a disaster. And so to continue on down the coast as best you can and get over the next, just get to the next stage and get to the next stage, and it ended up that was the best decision, and there was a lot of input for a lot of people, and ultimately the sailing master and the skipper made that decision. So I guess that's just, comes back to a lot of elements, but the decision making, know that before you depart.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, I think that is really important, and Máire, I think when you think about in 2018, we had a couple of really challenging backseat drivers on the rail. In the end, sort of had to set some rules that there was 5 minutes of input, and then the tactician was making the decision, and had to get really, really strict about that because everybody had an opinion in which direction the wind was going to come from, and just had to shut those conversations down because they become really distracting and when you're out there sailing. And it is better to have that conversation sitting in the bar rather than in the middle of the ocean when things start going wrong. Geoff, one for you. I mean, it's nice to see the days of the HF radio are dead, thank heavens. Maybe. But the comms gear is still pretty critical. VHF, sat phones. What to you are the really key things to make sure that you've actually got the right, reliable gear? Because in some ways, HF was pretty good. When you spoke on it, everybody in the fleet knew where you were. I think put a bit of work in to make them work. But anyway, these days, you've got VHF and satellite. What are the key things? Because satellite phone's not necessarily the whole answer to everything, is it?
Well, I'm not up with what the Hobart race you have to have, but in my days it was always HF.
Yeah, it's not big this year.
Is it gone differently?
Yeah, this
On
year
the
it's
sat
the
phone.
first year it's on.
So it's first year, it's gone, okay. Is that to do with the protest from last year about missing a radio
So
scale?
SATCOM.
So what I can tell you about satellite phones is you need to know how to use them. And we've trialled them here in WA and had pretty good success, but what we did learn is that carbon sails can get in the road of your signal. So you need to, if you've got carbon sails, you need to think about that and position yourself so that the carbon sail's not between your sat phone and the satellite that you need to get to. But the important thing is, from what I've learned in WA, is just learning how to use them. And satellite, the good thing with the HF radio, when you talk to someone, you would get an automatic reply, they talk back to you. So you know you've got through and you're talking to someone. Sat phone, sometimes you're sending messages through a sat phone and you don't necessarily know if it's been received. Luckily, the authorities now sort of detail how the message, when you get a message through, they will respond and then you will need to respond back so that both parties know that it's been received and it's been heard back. So getting a sat phone and using it before race day or the first get is a really important thing. And in WA, you have to be able to send a message. You've got to send a message before a certain date before you do a major offshore race. And I would imagine the Hobart's the same thing. That doesn't mean that you know how to use the phone when you're out at sea. So take it on your boat, go sailing, and just make sure there's nothing else getting in the road. And I'm surprised that they've gone to a lot of phones because the HF radio is very good. And I know across Bass Strait, we all have internet on the race boats now to download our weather files and get the information. I know going across Bass Strait, there's a window where you can't get anything. So you've got to sail for about 40 footer, it's about a day. You've got to get across to get your next fix to get the weather. So yeah, that's all I know. But it's, if you don't haven't used it, speak to the guys who hire the sat phones or sell the sat phones are normally pretty good with helping you out. And you can hire them, so that's the cheapest way to go. And when we've done the Exmouth race, we've had to hire one for the Exmouth race, and we've always extended it to when the boat gets back. So the crew doing the delivery know that they've got perfect range, because in WA, not all boats, we don't have to have HF radios, we've got VHF radios, and you don't always, not well received, so the sat phone is liable for that. That's it. I just wanted to add to John's thing about the crew, and what Anthony said, it is really important when you have a crew of 10 that you do know what everyone's roles are on the boat. And in my case, I've always been the sailing master on a Hobart race. Not when I was 21, but when I was a little bit older. So it's important that guy, and my job is always to keep the crew. Now, And I've sailed with boats, there's always been someone who gets seasick, and don't just let them lay in the bilge. You've got to pick them up and keep them active and keep them working. And everyone thinks I'm a prick because I get the sick guy, drag him up, make him sit on the rail. But those people come to me after the race and thank me for pushing them through that bad time, because if they just sat there in the cold water, got wet, cold, and they feel terrible and they don't get better. When you can keep them occupied and doing something, keeping their mind going, it does help. And also, it's doing that, but it's also keeping, my job as the watch captain or the leader is to make sure the watches are being attended to. So I'll sit down with each watch leader and drill into them that they have to stick to the watches. Don't let it go over, don't stay in bed, make sure that watches are changing and you're doing your jobs and keeping that in order. And when you sort of get that role, everyone sort of falls into it. He's in charge, he's second IC. But at the end of the day, the owner of the boat is the owner. You've got to make sure that you talk to them, and it goes two ways. So I think it's a really important thing, the crew knowing their roles.
All right, thanks very much, Geoff. And one of the comments I'll make on sat phone, because a lot of the comms has gone to using sat phone to SMS positions. And just think about what you're trying to do, going upwind in 40 knots, trying to actually use a phone keyboard to SMS a message. It's actually practically impossible. So one of the things I actually do is I actually pre-program all the messages for the race into the sat phone, and I just press send. Select the message and press send. One thing that works really well, because you cannot sit on the side of the rail and try and SMS or even downstairs when the boat's going up and down a couple of metres at a time. So one thing, Todd, navigation, there's not a whole lot of rocks in Bass Strait, but there's some really good currents and challenges. I'm talking about, because something we don't see on the East Coast, but certainly, I don't know about you, the three races I've seen, really, the people who picked where the current was are the people who are in the top three spots in every division.
Nearly for every division. The big boats.
Big boats.
It doesn't matter.
100 footers don't
100
count.
footers don't care about current.
They go too fast.
Yeah, the simple answer is you turn right, turn right. Out Sydney Head, you turn right. It's Tasman Island, you turn right. But the current, for the smaller boats, when I say smaller boats, it's less than 70 foot, where 2 to 3 knots of current makes a difference, a significant difference. So you've got the East Australian current that trundles down the East Coast. But it's sort of where they say it will be, but it moves, there's back eddies, there's all sorts of things that you would do the best you can with the data that you've got. But when you get out there, it's different. And how different it is really a bit of the luck of the draw. So you put yourself in the best position that you can. And for a race like the Hobart, where you're talking multiple days, it's not just where you want to be today, it's where you want to be in 24 hours' time and in 48 hours' time. So the race is really broken into, 5 parts. So out of the heads and down to Green Cape, and it's pretty much an uphill, downhill racetrack. So what I mean by that, either the wind's right behind you as a dead run, or it's right on the nose and it's a beat. That's the predominant wind direction for the Sydney Hobart. So once you clear, so down the New South Wales coast, you're either pushing out to sea or staying into the coast, and then the current will typically run all the way across Bass Strait. It depends on each year, it's quite different. In 2014, when we first did it, we had 3.5 knots current across Bass Strait in a stream that was about 40 mile wide, so it's a significant amount of water. But that'll also push you a long way off the Tasmanian coast. So once you've crossed Bass Strait, you've then got the east coast of Tasmania, and there's a big wind shadow off the east coast that extends out roughly about 100 mile, where you'll have light weather. So anything from the west, or norwest. We tend to have light winds as a wind shadow off the east coast of Tasmania. So again, if you've got big southerlies, that's not the case. And you'll have a northerly set current that runs up the east coast as well of Tasmania. So then you've got wind against waves. So you get some nasty steep seaway off the east coast. And then you go, wow, we finally got to Tasman Island. And yes, and you think, oh, we're nearly there, there's only 45 miles to go. The race starts again at Tasman. I think it's a torturous race. And Storm Bay and the Derwent are to be experienced, is what I would say. They are challenging places to sail. I've been up the Derwent, actually been into the bay and up the Derwent 5 times. I hate the Derwent. It is just a horrible place to sail. And I'll leave it at that.
Can I just
Yeah, go on. Free to add.
I just want to, one thing I will advise if you're doing a Hobart is get yourself a good weather router. Right, so you've got, we call him Cloud, but Roger Banham, who's one of Australia's top yachting meteorologists, and you can, it used to be $100. Back in 1987 we got printed pages about this thick with what the weather was doing, the cloud formation to be looking for, and you know, every day you'd get on deck and you'd read these and make sure it was happening. But those guys give you the currents, they show you where to go. Navigation software we've got these days is pretty good, but having the reassurance that you've got a world-renowned weather router giving you information and telling you where it is really handy. And I did the 98 Hobart, and in 98 we were all trying to go south pretty quickly, and you wanted to use the wind to get down there. The wind, we knew there was going to be a big front coming through, and when that front came through, you did not want to be in the current because it was going to be horrendous. We managed to get out of it and we were okay. We still didn't make it to Hobart, we ended up in Eden, but all the boats that got into trouble were stuck in the current. And the current goes down the coast, when it gets to the bottom of Victoria it goes out. And these guys all ended out outside in the maximum current against going south, against the wind coming from the south, so it would have been horrendous. So just being able to rely that you've got good information, you're not trusting yourself if you're not that good at it, is money well spent.
Yeah, I echo that. We've used him every time. We've done the Hobart. It's not expensive. I think it's only about $130 now. Really cheap as chips. And he is one of the most experienced people. There's times where it's just worth a little bit of investment. Máire, keeping everybody fed is always a good challenge, particularly if you get out there 3 or 4 days. You want to talk about sort of how do you do that, and how do you do that when it is blowing a gale?
Thanks. I suppose the first thing I would say is make sure you've got your antiemetics on board. So that's going back to the medication. So it's part of that planning in the advance. The other thing that has worked for us is, again, that it would actually tap into knowing what the weather is going to do as well. So if you know that it's going to be on the nose for the next couple of days, really having a hot meal and all sitting down for a cup of tea and cake is highly unlikely. So frozen sandwiches and frozen lamb chops and like the protein feasts essentially that happen on racing are one of the key things that we have found. And then if the weather lightens, one of the things we've done previously is on boats is that we've had a thermos, and then you would actually fill the thermos with hot water so it would be ready then for later on. But for any kind of, I suppose, anybody who's doing long journeys, and there's people here that are cruising and they're doing way longer journeys from us. One of the preparation races that I did was the Melbourne Hobart, and I also did Fremantle up to Bali, just to see what it's like and what you actually do in those situations. But again, it's the planning in advance, it's knowing what the weather is, it's knowing, we said we had a vegetarian on our boat when I sailed with Enterprise, and so the key was if you've opened it and it's not got meat in it, it's not yours. So knowing what people want. And then we tended to eat kind of every 6 hours approximately. We had 3 meals a day, and then we would have snacks in between. So that worked really well for us.
Thanks for that, Máire. I'll add this. You certainly don't want to come and boat with us because it's frozen sandwiches or it's freeze dry. But whilst it sounds extreme, again, a trick with a freeze dry, we use a 6-pack ecstasy. You put 3 packets of freeze dry in it, you pour boiling water in it, and it actually stays hot for 2 to 3 hours. So actually just make up enough freeze dry to feed the whole crew, and it stays hot.
That's not that bad. It's not that bad. It's actually quite nice.
When you're freezing cold and it's hot, you actually don't taste it. It's just 2 days in. It's in extreme conditions it works well, but again it's just a really simple trick. You just use a 6-pack ecstasy and you fill it half up with freeze dry, and it will stay really quite hot for 2 to 3 hours. John, jump to you. Rotations. Done a fair few long distance races. Is there an optimal shift watch rotation?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of whatever works. What seems to work for us is on a really long race is to have a rolling one, so you're not, for a shorter race, like even maybe 2 or 3 days, you might just have a fixed watch system where you know exactly what hours you're doing. Generally 4 hours, we do 4 hours on, 4 hours off, but and then if you're on a much longer race than that, so maybe a Bali race or even for Exmouth, you might start to rotate it so you're not doing all nights, unless there are people that really like night sailing or really flourish in that, or that sort of graveyard shift if you're going from 11 till say 3, that time slot. So I guess the other thing is having the important people on board at the time, so you're probably back to back with someone. So you'll always, the navigator will usually float, and then you'll have back to back foredeck, trim, helm, depending on the number of people on the boat. I guess on the bigger boats though, usually they might have an on crew, an off crew, and a standby crew. Just kind of 4 people sailing the boat at a time. On our little boats, we tend with 6 of us or something, then we'll have even go down to 2 up and 4 down. It just depends really on the conditions, but at certain times you'll have everybody up for sure if there's a manoeuvre, because it's not worth that manoeuvre going wrong at all, so you'll have everyone on deck. But yeah, by and large, longer races try and roll it through. Shorter races have a fixed system, seems to work for us.
Anybody else want to comment on watch systems? It's always good. One with different opinions.
You should ask all of us here, then we all get it.
A couple of things. Well, from a double-handed perspective, we rest whenever we can. As frequently as we can and whenever you can. And that depends on the condition, as John alluded to. If we're downhill with the spinnaker up and it's windy, night time, we just sleep in the cockpit. And you might get 20, 30 minutes, change out, and you'd run all night doing that. And with the longer races, as long as you're getting 3 to 4 hours sleep a day, we'd manage on that for 2 to 3 days. Although I've got older, so I'm not sure if I'd still be able to do that. With the fully crewed races, we typically would set up rotations cognizant of a 90-minute sleep cycle, and also whether you're changing in and out of gear, because you're 15 to 20 minutes to really strip off, get into a bunk, and the same to reverse the process to get up on deck. So any watch system that we're looking at, you need to have that in mind. So ideally, no less than 2 hours, and I'd prefer 4 hours.
I suppose one of the things that I would have observed over the years is that essentially from a watch system, what you're actually doing is planning around weather. So very often at the start of the race, if we know that we're going to have light weather, you'd have certain drivers doing that bit, and then if you knew the heavy weather was going to come in, you'd actually rest those drivers early, so that to make sure that they were kind of on form and able to kind of drive the boat later on that evening. And I suppose that was one of the key things that I would notice to watch. Having the 4 hours is ideal, and then when you come out of your bunk to do the activity, whatever that is, so change, whatever that is, it's done, and then you go back downstairs again. And there's rigour attached to that to make sure that it happens and everybody has rest, and you keep in that system.
Like I said, all of us will do things slightly different, and it's important that you work with the crew and work out a system. But for me, being the racing sailor, when I'm campaigning boats, we will do 4 hours on, 2 hours off during the evenings. So from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m, we'll do 4 hours on, 2 hours off. And in the day, so that we don't always end up on the same watches, and generally we'll have 3 watches on a boat. So on a 40 footy, you might have 10 crew. You take the navigator out of that, that leaves 9 people. So then you've got 6 people always on deck, and I hate the word standby watch. My thing is, if you're on deck, push hard. But the guys that are about to go off, they work harder than the guys that have come on, and you just get used to how the boat's been sailing. But so during the day, it's 6 hours on, 3 hours off. And the idea with that is that one of the watches is going to get 6 hours of sleep during the day. And also you're going on to different time slots, so you're not always waking up on the same watch during the race, getting different times. And I think that's important. Now, I've tried that with some boats. Some crews, the older crews, it might not have worked as best, but for every race I've done to Hobart, it's been spot on. And generally, as you're getting close to the Tasman Island, you find people don't want to go off watch. They want to push through to the finish. So if they've got the stamina to do that, I think we're working something's right.
Thanks, Geoff. I think it does depend. One of the other things to think about on watch system on the bigger boats is stagger when people change. Some boats like ours didn't have a lot of room, and when you put 3 people downstairs and they're trying to change together, there actually isn't enough room. So some of it you can actually just change one person every hour, and you just So there's no actual real answer on the watch system. You've got to try a bunch of things, figure out what works for yourself and your crew. Geoff, come to your expertise. What sails do you take to Hobart? Really make a sail selection for a long race.
Geez, this takes weeks, months to work out. But look, every boat goes to Hobart with a different goal. And if you're going to Winning, you're trying to do it IRC, and you've got to pick your sails, and you've got to select the right sails for the race. So really, if you're a racing boat, that sail selection comes down to the last couple of days, and you'll look at the race and say, is it an upwind race? If it's an upwind race, we're going to take, and what's the most weather we're going to be, and you'll pick the sails to suit for that race. If it's a downwind race, for instance, the race, I think 2018, was just about a run all the way to Hobart. So most boats went and got their old running spinnaker, the 3rd old running spinnaker, and put them on board, and so if they blew out one, they've got another one to go up. So look at the conditions and work out what you're going to use. Hopefully you're not going to blow out sails, but it happens. And I must admit, it's a long race getting to Hobart, and in, what was the year I did with Anger Management, 2018, I sailed with a crew that had never sailed them up before. And I was there to coach them, to get them to Hobart and not embarrass them. And I remember sailing out of Sydney Heads, it was quite windy, and we put our A3 up and sailed off, and some of the Sydney boats are going Hobart, all got their big spinnakers up, flying through, and they're going a bit quicker than us. But about 4 hours later, we managed to sail through the fleet because they didn't have spinnakers anymore. And a lot of those boats blew their spinnakers out on the first day and had one left to choose, whereas we had all 4 to take us on the coast. So the guys got to Hobart in a very good form. They weren't embarrassed, but they had the sails. But an example, Bill Henson's in the room tonight, and he's going to Hobart this year. And me being his sailmate, he came and sat down with me and said, what do I need to get to Hobart? I said, well, what are your goals? And he said, well, I want to get to Hobart and do well. And And so with his boat, don't know if you've seen the beautiful Serene in the club, the JPK 45, it's a great looking boat and it reaches really well. So I said to Bill, well, if you're going to have any chance of winning the race, you need to set your boat up to what your boat is suited to. So your boat is suited to reaching. So there's no good getting more upwind sails and trying to keep your upwind performance because the other boats are going to kill you. If it's dead square downwind, you're not going to be featuring in the results. But if it turns, fingers crossed, if it turns into a reach all the way down, set your boat up so you can reach as fast as you possibly can. So with that, Bill put a jib top on board. He's got his fingers crossed and his feet crossed, and I've got them too, hoping that come Boxing Day it's going to be a 2-sail reach down to Hobart. And if it is, he is set up to go really, really well. And if it's not, sorry, Bill. But that's it for the sails, really. Those choices we don't make until Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve we'll start to put the sails on, and I can tell you on Christmas Day I'm normally down there taking one off, replacing with another one. So it's going to come down to the weather conditions at the end of the day and what you're going to get. Okay.
Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, I think your point also about the Spinnaker is a good one. I mean, you think about the Far 40 is a pole-back boat, and what's the sail used all the time is an S2. So if you go on a 3-day race and leave the dock with only one S2, it's the definition of madness. Because you need to take two. And we did blow up our S2 in 2018 with 2 hours from the start. We'll get the second one. One of the things, Todd, John, one of the two we pick about this, but reefing, because it is one of those things in the Hobart. Just, talk about the importance of actually really knowing how to put a reef in, do it quick, and how that really is important to the safety.
Do it quickly.
Do it quickly.
I guess a couple of things. Just going back to the sails, I think if you've got anxious crew, so you're heading out, and what you don't want to do is, say, pull the luff tape off in the first hour. Something you really have to try and preserve your sails, so you do have to go in with a bit of a mindset of looking after the gear, otherwise you won't get there, or you won't get there quickly. Reefing is another thing. If you're on a boat that's going to take 3 or 4 days, and you're always going to see multiple weather systems, and you're always going to have to be able to put reefs in and out. And they'll always say reef early, and that's decision making. So you need to know the crossovers on the sails really well. So you need to know whether you're going to pull a reef in or you're going to change your jib down, or if the weather's deteriorating, you may want to be able to reef later because you don't want people going up on the foredeck. You need to make those decisions. Reefing has to work, it has to be good. A lot of boats have different. On our boats we usually have single line reefing, so you just have one line that runs up the luff, back, up the leach, and so you can pretty well, one person can drop a reef in and out, certainly on the first and second reef. On Bill's boat, he's got a separate line that runs on the tack and on the leach. So you've got 6 lines running back to the 3 reefs, and then other boats will have different combinations depending what they've got. Boats generally go, when the wind's getting up, as fast or faster with the reefing. So you've just got to be really mindful to reef early, particularly if you're in building pressure or you're starting to use too much helm.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll just add a couple of things. Reefing is something that we probably practice at least before every second race. Make sure it's going to go in, that you can do it quick. But the other thing, even though we're a race boat, you'll see there's laser jacks on the boat. Just because you're a race boat doesn't mean you should put laser jacks on there. The best thing you can have when you're going to put a reef in. And they might only be very thin pieces of Dyneema, but it's really easy to put a reef in if you've got a laser jack on. So, again, it's just something to think about. You have a look on a boat, the laser jacks actually all pull forward to the mast so they're out of the way when you run full head sail. They just deploy back, and then putting reef in is very easy with the laser jacks on the boat. I can't emphasise, in my view, that thing and do it early. Boats really don't slow down that much.
And one of the difficult things, actually putting in the reefs and shaking them out, that's probably the easy part. Then you've got to get crew up onto the boom to tie up the sail.
Yeah.
And that's a whole another challenge of work that needs to be done. And if you don't do it, your sail will flog apart. With the second or third, particularly once you're down to 3 reefs, and most of the race last year, we had 3 reefs in the race. That doesn't, within 3 to 4 days, you can destroy a mainsail. So you've then got to look at being up on deck, tying up the sail, how are you going to do that? One of the very good suggestions we were given this year was actually to have a Dyneema line on the underside of the boom that you would then clip your harness to on your short tether. So you actually clip to the boom while you're up on the deck to tie the sail up.
All right, last question from me, and then we'll throw to the audience. And Máire, this one's to you. Talking about wet weather gear and why it's important that you're warm. What are some of the things
I get the fashion question.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I researched this a lot. I spoke to more women in this club and all over the place about what they wore when they went offshore. Some of them are in the room tonight. So there was Lynn, there was Robbie, there's people like Alison Stock, Linda Bethrick. There's a whole bunch of women that had done offshore races that I just went in and I said, I need to tap into what I need to wear and how I need to get for me to be comfortably. So what I would say, so the upshot of all of that, what I found works for me, is that the merino base layers are particularly good because they actually wick away if you're sweating or anything like that. And also when you're wet, they don't feel as wet. The next thing that we actually did, so is I was using a mid-layer. Initially, with the first Hobart that I did with Enterprise, we used Zeke. The second Hobart that I did, I actually got a waterproof layer as the mid layer, and I found that to be a wee bit better. And then the next thing that I would do, so I found for the Hobart races, and certainly for going south, essentially each night I was getting a little bit colder as we would go along, and that could be tiredness, it could be awful, and it's the conditions. And so you're kind of continually layering up as you go, and then a fleece is very handy, and then you've got your wet weather gear. Last year was quite wet, and I brought my gear back to Monkey Visit because I said I was wet. And I said, this shouldn't have happened. I had my two, I stuck at my formula, and essentially what Remy said to me was, he said, at some point when you're getting that much water over the boat, you're going to get wet. The gear will not. The only thing he could see that would work was a plastic bag. So what I would suggest going forward for this race is, and then I suppose the other thing is having a second pair of thermals as well is actually a really good idea. What I found is when you're getting a lot of water over the boat, the other thing that happens is I'm a sensitive soul. So I kind of get, the salt goes around my face and I find that gives a wee bit of a rash. So I would change neck gaiter on a regular basis or use Sudocrem. And then speaking of Sudocrem, it's very good for you to make sure that you don't get any rashes anywhere else. So I would highly recommend everybody have their own personal jar, regardless of where they're going, actually, to be really honest. Baby powder would be slippy, so that's fine. So, I'm just going to check my notes. So what I was suggesting, and now bearing in mind I'm middle of the boat, so I'm not at the pointy end. So I suggest 2 lots of waterproof gear. So outers and mids, two lots of thermals, a fleece, neck gaiters, good boots I think are essential. Because if you've got dry feet, life's just good. And then merino I found worked really well. Last year, one of the things that somebody had brought on the boat, it wasn't me, but I found them. They had these wee little hot pads that you can actually use for kind of like deep heat things. And when I was feeling really cold, I actually managed to use one of those, and I found those to be quite good, as well as hand warmers. And I suppose like outside of the gear, some of the stuff that we've used are sea rugs, so when you are really wet downstairs, so something that actually dries you out, and you're still being able to sleep getting warm. Rotating positions, so on some of the racing boats, one of the things that we like to do is sit on the rail. It's always fun. And then we name them by sponges and their position. So your first sponge, if you're at the very front of the boat, and then you go to second sponge, third sponge, and so on and so forth. First sponge tends to get particularly wet, pulled very quickly, rotate the first sponge down. Do you know what I mean? Give them a wee bit of a break. So things like that is actually quite a nice thing to do to treat your colleagues well. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was actually being aware when you're cold. And so with somebody actually saying that I am cold and they need to go downstairs and then warm up, do whatever needs to be done, you wear anybody's clothes at that stage, it doesn't really matter. Do you know what I mean? And then come back up on deck and then you're able to participate in the race again. They would be my key things. Anybody else? Oh, bow, actually. I think Todd was thinking smocks for people on bow is actually quite important, and possibly at their level.
I thought you said bowel.
No.
So, in fact,
Pointing.
in fact, toileting really is going to be a question that's going to come up. How tricky can that be?
Is that about
5 knots or 25 knots?
Well,
did I get that question right? You're asking about using the
well,
toilet.
Mary
instead of putting
said bow, but I just said bowel, and I'm thinking about everyone thinks on a boat, some of the discomfort or comfort can be going to the toilet, right?
Yes. I
Which of you want to answer
boys or
that
girls
question?
answer this first? Boys.
It's a shit question.
Yes,
2 years ago, I was introduced to a urinal, and I wish I'd been introduced to that in sailing about 20 years ago, because it is so much easier to use downstairs than having to relieve yourself up on deck. So, yes, so keeping it as simple and as comfortable as you can.
Yeah.
What for?
Oh no, I'd agree. Which I use yours.
You can share them with close crew.
However, you are only talking about number one.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so as the nurse, I'll take the next level. So going to the toilet on a boat is quite important. And I think one of the things that you, I would say, I think females are actually at an advantage here, because we have to do it all of the time. It's not a strange event, and it's not a one-off event. If you can, I would actually say, see if you can rotate it around when the water is slightly flatter. If you can't, I would strongly recommend not using the toilet lid seat or the lip, because it does move up and down. But I also think it's something that you need to be conscious of to make sure that you drink enough water and that you do need to be peeing. You do need to, stick to your normal regime. Whatever your normal regime is, if you go every day, you should be going every day on the boat. One of the things, I suppose, also from a toileting perspective, and many in this room will be aware, is that nothing goes down the toilet, or not much does, so no paper or anything like that, so it's put into a paper bag and it's discarded elsewhere. And then if there were other problems, so on somewhere else, somebody actually got a urinary tract infection, which is particularly uncomfortable for that individual, and we were in the fortunate situation, which is the first time for me, that we were actually able to use the antibiotics that we had brought with us, and we were able to start supporting that or preventing that infection. So there would be my suggestion.
And you?
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. That's so enough questions
Geoff does
from
good.
me. I'm going to throw it open to the audience for any questions for the panel or for myself. Yep. Oh, hi, Robbie.
Hi. Having done 2 Sydney to Hobart, there's one thing that's totally missed. When you come into Constitution Dock and you're a rock star in your own legion, people tell you about it, every one of you.
All right, so that question is, yeah, when you come into Constitution Dock,
You did.
and talk about the welcome you get from Constitution Dock.
Well, I was planning to go back one step, and I will talk about Constitution Dock because it is awesome. But in 1998, we ended up in a place called Eden. And I just want to tell you about, if you're doing the Hobart and you do have to pull out of the race and you do end up in a small country town, in 98 we know what happened there. We were about the 5th boat into Eden, and we were met at the dock by locals. We also had an ambulance waiting for one of our crew. The locals came down with sleeping bags because we didn't have anything. So when you start the Sydney to Hobart yacht race, there's a container at the yacht club, and you put all your clothes in the container, and if it's a racing boat, anything that weighs too much you can't take. We didn't have the glory of having 2 sets of thermals or anything like that. It's 1 set of thermals for us and off you go. But everything goes in the container. So you don't have, in our case, we didn't have our wallets. We didn't have tickets for planes, anything. So we ended up in Eden with nothing. And the people came to our support, the local publican. Luckily we were only the 5th boat in, so there was still room. And he said, you can come and stay at my pub. There's a room you can sleep all the crew in. And we'll just run a tab for each of you individually. Help yourself. So we got to the pub. We went next door to the local clothing store and bought some thongs and some shorts and another t-shirt. And that was all done without any money changing sides. It was, you will send the money to us later. The buses and Qantas, who was a sponsor back in those days, got all our bags back to Melbourne airport for us. We were stuck in Eden for 5 days. We had to pack our boat up. The owner went back and got his truck and drove it down. We had 5 days in Eden where our meals were supplied, our drinks were supplied, our bedding was supplied. None of it any money. And those people were just awesome. So don't be afraid. And that's something I really remember. That's one of my fondest memories of the Hobart race, is just the generosity that came out from people in Eden. Now, back to arriving at Constitution Dock.
Thank you.
The other thing, before I get there, is when you do it, soak up the atmosphere of Sydney Harbour. That is the one, when I sit down and brief my crew going out to the start, I say, guys, just soak this up. Just enjoy it and take it for what it is, have fun, but half an hour before the start we go into race mode. And that's something, it's just awesome to be on Sydney Harbour watching all the spectators there and being part of it, waving to all the boats and the helicopters and watching the maxi sail past and that. When you get to Constitution Dock, there's family, friends waiting for you, there's people you don't know waiting for you to cheer you in, and even if you're a WA boat. The welcome you get as you motor through. In the old days, we used to go underneath the drawbridge and all the boats went into there, except for the big boats. So if there was a 100-foot fleet, it'd be 4 boats outside and all the rest were in that little area. And the welcome you got in Hobart was fantastic. And it's memories that will stick with you for life. And you are treated, it's like you got the keys to the city until you hop on the plane and fly home. You can street drink, you can do whatever you can, you can't any other time. So yeah, it's well worth it. And it makes the Hobart fun. And I know we get to Hobart and we go, what are we doing this for? This is crap. Beating into the wind, it's wet, cold. And a day later, after being in Hobart, a few rums and the generosity of people, you get all that and we go back next year.
Yeah, so it's a typical offshore race where the parties beforehand are really good and the parties afterwards are really good, and you tolerate the yacht race to do the party.
Yeah, I mean, you probably, many of you probably have been to Hobart at that time of year, but it is a magic place. It is absolutely sensational. There's generally 4 races that finish in Hobart, so there'll be the Melbourne Hobart, East Coast, West Coast, Lonnie Hobart and the Sydney Hobart. So you might have a couple of 100 boats and everyone just wandering around that place having an absolutely fat time. Yeah, so it doesn't really matter what time you get in, and it doesn't matter whether you're first or last, you'll still get the same warm reception. There's a double-handed boat with a cat last year. They came in, I think they were that New Year's Day? And everyone was, down there cheering them on, so it is sensational.
I backed that up actually. If I could just talk about when we did the 2018, that was my first one. And going to Hobart was my dream. It was it. It was kind of like, you know, it didn't matter what else happened after Hobart. It was the fact that I got there. So we had great advice. I'll back up what Geoff said. We were said in Sydney, there was silence on the boat and you just absorbed everything and it was just phenomenal. You get out the heads and you just do what you do. And so that was great. But then when we came into Constitution Dock, or when we came into Hobart at that time, we were very fortunate. Earlier in the day, it was about 2 when we were arriving, and earlier in the day they'd actually closed off some of them. And so the Taste Festival is going on, which is essentially wine and a whole bunch of other foods. And people are just lined up there having lunch. And so we were one of the first couple of boats that actually went down, said everybody's had a few wines. This is a boat from, doesn't matter where we were from. They started a Mexican wave. And it was all for us. And then it was just phenomenal. Then as you come around and you meet the family, it's just, honestly, I had tears. I really did. It's just the most amazing experience. I'd recommend it to everybody. Slightly different to Gerald.
And as Todd says, you just got to do the yacht race in between.
That's all right.
All right, other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I've never done a Hobart before. There might be some other people here that haven't done one either. So I've just myself, and if anyone else is interested as well, I'd like to do the Hobart this year. So just kind of putting my hand up, and I'll make some efforts to get on a crew. If I can't find one over here, I've got some contacts over east, but just anyone else looking to do a Hobart?
Yeah.
Well,
The West Coast.
just putting it out there.
I'm just going to give you,
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
just give you some advice. In 1987, you could have gone and stood on the dock with a sign saying, "Want to get to Hobart," and we could pick you out as we walk down the dock. But today, you've got to have the qualification. So if you haven't, not part of a crew, things you have to do is your sea survival course. You've got a medic, first aid thing. Anything you can bring to the boat that adds value to having you on the crew is going to help you get a spot. Okay? And
Yeah. Radio
the quicker you get in and pick up those boats that are there, go for it. Best of luck.
Thanks. Geoff, I love the image of you going through a sail wardrobe the way I go through my library, thinking, yes, that one, no, not that one. But for the boats that would do a Hobart and perhaps are not emphasising the racing, but the completion, and that's probably similar to a lot of the boats that are looking at doing the Indonesia next year. Same question in terms of what advice for a sail wardrobe. You know, you get to the point of saying, am I taking a spare main? You know, how many jibs and you know, what wardrobe would you look at for that? To say, let's be able to get there and get back, assuming there's no disaster and the boat remains intact.
Yeah, so it depends on what your goal is. So if you're trying to win a race, you're trying to minimise the weight. But if you're not trying to win a race, I would suggest you're doing something like Indonesia. If you've got a spare mainsail, it's always good to carry. In the old days of the Hobarts, when we first did it, we would always have a spare mainsail bricked up in the boat in case we damage one. That doesn't happen these days. The materials have got better and stuff like that. But you know, a lot of boats can do this race with just a furling genoa and a mainsail and their storm sails. So you've got to have the storm sails for your category. And I think going to Indonesia, it's going to be a Cat 1 or Cat 2 race. So you're going to have storm sails for those. So storm jib and trysail have to be on board. You're going to have a heavy weather jib. So that's got to be on board for those two categories. After that, you can pretty much go whatever you like. So a lot of boats, if you've got a cruising boat with one mainsail with 3 reefs, you don't need to have a trysail. If you've got a furling genoa, it's going to take you through most of the range, that would do. I would suggest that you have a heavy weather jib as a backup in case you damage your furling genoa or it's too big and you can't reef it down far enough. And then I'd suggest having one spinnaker at least so you can have some fun in the light winds when it goes behind and put up the colourful sail. So yeah, it's just horses for courses. It doesn't. If you've got a spare main and you're on a cruising boat where weight is an issue, it would be good to have that. And we used to store our battens for the spare sails in the boom, and we'd even take spare battens in a lot of the early races, have them shoved into the berm and taped in there so that if you broke a batten, you could replace one. And then your sail repair kit's having that, so you can fix everything that you're going to break during the race, like spare slides, repair easy tape to put on, Dr. Sails, which is blue, you can stick onto fabric and stick a wet sail together and patch it up. So things like that. So again, it comes back, if you're going to Indonesia and you know that the weather's going to be a 2-sail reach all the way there, well, maybe splash out and buy a specialty reaching sail. It's going to help you get there quicker. And it will make your sailing more fun as well. So yeah, so if you put a spare main on, take one.
Yes.
What provision for talking about sales and that? Do you have any provision for repairing them while you're racing?
Yep. We'll have sail. Every boat will have a sail repair kit on board, and I generally take my own sail repair kit. So it's got stuff in it
And what
too.
would that consist of?
You'll have adhesive sailcloth that you can, if you tear a spinnaker, you can start sticking spinnakers back together. You will have hand sewing kit with needles and thread, a palm, so you can sew. Even on big maxis, we'll take nuts and bolts so we can bolt a sail back together again. Dr. Sails is, I think, a really important thing these days. You buy them in like a silicone gun and you just squeeze the glue on and you can seal it off, and that can last a long time. Your slides, whatever slides you have on your mainsail, you want to have at least a spare set of those, so you can change them over if you start breaking them. Battens, we'll generally have a batten in your sail repair kit somewhere stored away, so if you do break one, you can sew one in, shorter one in.
What about a sewing machine?
Sewing machines, not so much now with Dr. Sails. So even around the world boats really don't have sewing machines on board anymore. If you're a cruising boat and you've got a little sewing machine you take, great, take it with you. But now Dr. Sails has kind of made sewing machines on board. On racing boats anyway, you just don't want to carry the extra weight.
Phil?
Todd, tell us what it's like to sail a boat backwards down the way.
It's really easy, Phil. Last year's Hobart, there was a bit of breeze. And it's the first time, so we've got 45 to 50 knots. We've been on the nose for too long, about 3.5 days by this point in time. 3 reefs, number 5. So we're actually powering along, passing boats. We're sailing quite well. I was quite pleased with how we're going. You've got a short seaway, and with breaking water over, most crests are breaking, and so you're picking a spot on where you're going to go over the waves. There's this one particular wave where basically it was all breaking, so I thought, well, I'll just poke it up. And then the wave kept getting bigger and bigger, and lo and behold, we've stopped, and we're now sliding backwards. And that in itself's really actually quite scary, because if you flick the wheel the wrong way, you can actually crash, tack the boat, roll down the wave, and be basically laid flat. And with a big enough wave, you'd actually roll over. So anyway, Muggins here, we flicked the wheel the right way, and off we go again. So yes, thanks for that question, Phil.
Excuse me, that is much more polite than when I first heard you tell that.
But I did seek out others, actually just to expand on the story, as a serious question from some more experienced sailors than myself. Because the wave, we're at 4 to 6 metre seas, and they will get much bigger than that. And you go, well then how do you sail over seas that are bigger than that? And after a few people, actually about half a dozen people, the answer is you don't. And you just sail the troughs. And you go in the direction you can until the weather changes. So, yes, it was an interesting race.
Up the back, up rather. Yep.
Racing helms in your team, how many did you carry? First question. And the second one is, after the tick all the boxes here, is there any on the safety issues, any other audits going on in Sydney? So it's 2 questions.
Yes, I think the question was how many helms did we have on board?
Racing helms.
racing helms. And so, if I don't count myself, because I wouldn't count myself as the racing helm, out of 11 we had 5 people who could drive the boat. But we had 3 who could drive the boat with 35 plus. And then if it was 15 downwind, I'd drive. So occasionally I gave them a rest. But you need a lot of help on a race boat, particularly like if you're going downwind, you know, you're swapping people out on the helm 45 minutes to an hour. And then on the safety front, you know, generally with CY, CA, you know, you'll do the audit, you get all your Cat 1, almost 100% of the boats get a spot audit sometime on the 24th or 25th. So particularly if you're parked in the CYCA Yacht Club, somebody will hop on the boat. And then if you come across Andy, you park the boat and he walks down the wharf and he stops and looks and, you know, so if you ever think about letting off your middle lifelines while you're parked in CY, you've got to remember to tighten before you park the boat, because Andy walks up and gives you an earful about the fact that your lifelines aren't tight enough. So, but on the same side of it, we joked a little bit about the safety standards. One of the things about that group there is they are pedantic, but they also are there to help you actually get through it. And so I'll come and tell you what's wrong, and then I'll tell you how to fix it. So they are pretty pedantic, but they are actually a pretty helpful group. But you're going to have to make sure every little detail's right when you're in there. And we didn't touch on it, but you know, I think at Hobart there's about 24 forms to fill out before you actually even get the start line as well, or more.
Yeah, just something from the side, following up Chris's question. Shorthanded, how much of the time were you using autopilot versus on yourself?
So the double-handed one was in 2022, and it's predominantly downhill, which was great in the way I like to go. We would have only used the autopilot 10% of the time for the race. It was quite breezy going across Bass Strait with the running, with the wind behind us, sort of low 30 knots for most of it. So in race mode, you're pretty much always faster to hand steer than to use the autopilot. Autopilot will be faster in ideal conditions, and it was by no means ideal conditions.
What sort of autopilot do you have? Yeah, basically that.
So B&G H5000, so with the Hercules processor, and the best compass without going to the full around the world sort of gyro compasses that they use. So a digital.
French.
B&G's, I'm not sure. Well, Navico, so it was English. I'm not sure where the technology now lies.
Last one, Doug. I think so.
Last one.
Yep.
Communication. And you mentioned that HF is no longer used in it, so it comes back to satellite phones. When you've got radio and a message comes in, then you can hear it. But with satellite phone and you're out on the deck, how do you hear it? Is that stored down below? Is it stored in somebody's pocket? So for instance, if somebody's in a bit of strife and they need a hand, and you've got to stand by.
So you're still running VHF.
Still running
and
VHF.
You've got a 20 nautical mile range with the VHF, and with the size of the fleet. You know, when we stopped for colour, we heard them on VHF.
Right.
You know, so, and then generally, what you actually find is interesting is I found that what people were doing was actually relaying messages across the VHF. So,
Yeah, okay, so...
but it is, I'm not a fan of that.
No.
I'd
okay.
actually like an HF radio, and I'd like to hear what's happening in the whole fleet.
That was the next part of the
Yeah.
question, because 98, a lot of people heard what was going on before they got there.
Yeah.
And sat phone, you don't get that with that.
Well, take a recent race here where none of us heard the boat was sinking, for example, which I actually, anyway, that's personal prejudice.
There are some shortfalls with the SATCOMs, but they're also with the HF. Like the HF is only working because they run a relay vessel, two?
Yeah.
So one at the front of the fleet, one at the back of the fleet. So a lot of the HF is still ground wave.
So it still bounces anyway.
Yeah, and then the SATCOMs, you only get verification via email half an hour later. Like it's not a great system.
Right.
At least when we've run it here, you get a text to say immediately from race control to say your position's received.
Yes.
So CYCA aren't doing that. It's done as a group email half an hour later. But they do know where you are. You're carrying yellow brick trackers, so they always know where you are.
Yes. Okay. No, it was just more about being able to hear that communication if you're in the cockpit.
Yeah, and the actual ringtone on satellite phones is very quiet on a boat. Because within the notice of race, race control can call you and you are meant to be able to pick up like you are on a watch system, for want of a description, on the sat phone.
Yeah.
I'm aware of a fixed sat phone, and then I had the mobile sat phone in a plastic pocket around my neck for the whole race.
Right, okay.
That's how to make sure you answer the phone.
Yeah. It's just first...
You just swap the battery.
Yeah, like first Sydney Hobart, we always had a HF, somebody's always sat on the HF phone all the way around.
Yeah, so this little sat phone in a plastic pocket around the neck, change the batteries.
Yeah. Okay.
That works. All right.
Great.
I think an hour and a half, a bit more than that.
Thank you so much, everybody. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.